The gilded doors of the Nash estate didn't open for ordinary people. They swung wide only for old money aristocrats, corrupt politicians, and high society heiresses with pearls at their throats and terror in their eyes. For years, every noblewoman in the city knew the rumor. To be invited into Salvador Nash's private quarters was not a privilege, it was a sentence. He was a sovereign built of shadow and blood, a man whose cold blue eyes could strip a woman's pride away before he even spoke a word. They whispered that no bride survived his dark, demanding nature, that his bed was a trap wrapped in silk, and that to fail him meant total social and physical ruin. So when the doors burst open on a rainy Tuesday evening, the aristocratic family waiting in the foyer expected another terrified heiress. They didn't expect Eva Green. She wasn't wearing satin. She wasn't trembling. She stood in the center of the marble hall with flour smudged across her cheek, her curves unapologetically filling a worn cardigan, and an unpaid ledger clutched like a weapon in her small, flour-dusted hands. She didn't ask for permission. She demanded the man who owned the city. In the glittering, cutthroat underworld of New York, power isn't just maintained through bullets, it's maintained through fear, bloodlines, and cold, calculated alliances. Salvador Nash was the undisputed king of that world, a man who had everything, controlled everyone, and felt absolutely nothing. To the high-born women paraded before him, he was an untouchable monster. They thought his heart was made of stone. They thought no woman could ever break through his icy domain. What they didn't know was that the monster was bored. He didn't want a soft, obedient bird in a gilded cage. He didn't want political perfection. He was waiting for someone with enough fire to burn his dark world to the ground. And when a headstrong baker with a bankrupt shop and a fierce soul walked straight into the lion's den to demand her dignity back, the king of the underworld didn't destroy her. He fell to his knees. Before we dive into this high-stakes tale of forbidden passion, hidden secrets, and lethal devotion, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Join our community of story lovers so you never miss another dramatic, heart-pounding romance audio story. Now, let's step into the dark world of Salvador Nash. To the rest of the world, Little Italy was a neighborhood of warm golden light, the rich aroma of simmering marinara, and the sweet, lingering scent of powdered sugar floating from cozy shop windows. But to the Nash syndicate, it was merely square footage on a ledger, a row of numbers waiting to be harvested. For 3 generations, Green's Bakery had been the heartbeat of Mulberry Street. Its red-painted wooden door had welcomed factory workers, neighborhood matriarchs, and wide-eyed children seeking morning pastries. But since her father's sudden passing 6 months ago, Eva Green had been fighting a silent, agonizing war to keep those doors open. Every morning at 4 o'clock, while the rest of the city slept in peaceful darkness, Eva was already knee-deep in flour. She rolled the dough until her shoulders throbbed, baked rows of golden cannoli shells, and carefully whisked rich, velvet creams. She poured her entire soul into the oven's heat, trying to bake away the crippling weight of grief and debt left behind in her father's wake. Eva was not the fragile, whisper-thin women featured on the covers of high society magazines. She possessed soft, full curves, hips that swayed with natural grace, and thick, dark hair that fell in soft waves around a face shaped by quiet determination. She had a heart too big for her own good and a stubborn streak wider than the Hudson River. Then came the white envelope. It didn't arrive by standard mail. It was dropped onto the bakery glass counter by 2 men wearing tailored black suits, leather gloves, and expressions as sharp as razor blades. Inside was a formal notice. Her late father's remaining mortgage debt hadn't just been transferred. It had been bought outright by Nash Enterprises. The interest had been recalculated overnight. The balance was staggering. The deadline was 3 days. If she couldn't pay, the deed to Green's Bakery would be seized, demolished, and replaced with a high-rise garage for syndicate vehicles. Her hands had shaken as she read the numbers. the parchment trembling in her small fingers. Fear, cold and heavy, had coiled tightly in her stomach. But as she looked around at the faded photographs of her parents hanging on the flour-dusted walls, fear transformed into a white-hot spark of defiance. She was not going to let a blood-money organization wipe out her family's legacy without a fight. That evening, as a steady rain slicked the cobblestone streets, Eva bypassed the police, ignored her friends' frantic warnings, and marched straight toward the Upper East Side. She didn't seek out a lawyer. She didn't write a polite letter. She went directly to the lair of the beast. The Nash Manor stood like a fortress against the gray sky, a sprawling Gothic estate enclosed by towering iron gates and guarded by armed men with eyes like flint. It was a place where high society families sent their daughters with trembling hands, praying for political favor while fearing the dark, ruthless rumors surrounding the syndicate's master. When Eva approached the massive iron gates, rain soaking through her practical coat and plastering dark curls to her face, the guards laughed. They assumed she was lost, or perhaps a delivery driver who had missed a turn. But when she raised her chin, looked the head guard dead in the eye, and demanded to see Salvador Nash himself, the laughter died in their throats. "He doesn't see peasants, sweetheart," the guard sneered, resting a heavy hand on his concealed holster. "Turn around before you end up in the river." "I am not a peasant," Eva said, her voice cutting through the downpour, crisp and unyielding. "I am a business owner whose property your boss is trying to steal. You tell Salvador Nash that Eva Green is standing at his door, and I am not leaving until he signs my repayment plan." The guard stared at her in utter disbelief. Nobody spoke the Don's name with such reckless audacity. Above them, on the second-story balcony of the manor, a tall shadow moved behind the heavy velvet curtains. Salvador Nash stood in the dim light of his study, a glass of dark scotch held loosely in his gloved fingers. He had been watching the scene unfold from the moment her small, determined frame appeared at the gates. He had expected another sniveling politician or another terrified heiress brought by her father to bargain for protection. Instead, he saw a woman standing drenched in the cold rain, her head held high, holding a soggy piece of paper like a battle flag. For the first time in 10 years, Salvador Nash felt the faint, thrilling spark of genuine curiosity. He lowered his glass and pressed a button on his desk console. "Let her in," Salvador commanded, his deep, gravelly voice echoing through the security comms. "Bring her directly to my study." The iron gates groaned open with a sound like grinding bones, granting Eva passage into a world built on blood and absolute authority. As she walked up the sweeping marble driveway, every step felt heavy, her rain-soaked boots leaving dark prints on the pristine stone. Escorted by 2 stony-faced guards, she was led through grand double doors into the manor's foyer. The interior was blinding, gilded mirrors, towering crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless art. In the center of the hall stood a group of high-society heiresses and their mothers, dressed in designer silk, whispering nervously among themselves. They were the daughters of prominent families, brought here to negotiate political truces or offer themselves as prospective brides to the syndicate kingpin. But as Eva walked past them, water dripping from her worn coat, flowers still visible along the cuff of her sleeve, their murmurs turned to sharp gasps of disgust. Eva didn't blink. She held her head high, her spine straight, her knuckles white around her ledger. "In here," one guard grunted, opening the heavy mahogany doors to the estate's private study. "Don't speak unless he addresses you. Don't make sudden movements, and keep your distance." The heavy doors clicked shut behind her, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. The study was massive, smelled of rich leather, expensive tobacco, and vintage mahogany. Shadows stretched across the room, illuminated only by the warm crackle of a grand fireplace. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, was Salvador Nash. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and imposing, draped in a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed power. When he slowly turned around, Eva felt her breath hitch in her throat. Salvador's face was a masterwork of hard angles, a sharp jawline shadowed by dark stubble, a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and eyes so icy blue they looked utterly lifeless. He radiated danger, a lethal predator who moved with quiet, terrifying grace. "You have 5 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have my men toss you into the East River," Salvador said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated straight through Eva's chest. A tremor of fear shot down her spine, but she crushed it instantly. She took 2 steps forward, entering his personal space, and slapped the wet ledger onto his polished glass desk. "You took over my father's debt," Eva said, her voice clear, resolute, and completely devoid of the trembling he was used to hearing from women. "You tripled the interest overnight and gave me 3 days to pay a sum that takes 5 years to earn. That isn't business, Mr. Nash. That's theft." Salvador didn't look at the paper. His icy gaze drifted slowly from her eyes, down to her soft, rain-slicked lips, over the curves of her chest heaving beneath her soaked coat, down to her wide hips, and back up to her flour-dusted face. Every woman in his world was thin, fragile, desperate to please, and terrified of his touch. But the woman standing before him possessed rich, breathtaking curves, eyes blazing with furious life, and a spine made of tempered steel. She wasn't begging. She was fighting. Salvador slowly walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from her. He towered over her, his oppressive shadow engulfing her small frame. He reached out a leather-gloved finger, slowly tracing the smudge of flour on her cheek. Eva shivered at the sudden heat of his touch, but she didn't step back. She held his dangerous gaze, her warm brown eyes locking onto his frozen blue ones. "You come into my house, soaked in rain, smelling of sugar and yeast, and call me a thief," Salvador murmured, his voice dipping dangerously low. "Do you have any idea who I am, little baker?" "I know exactly who you are," Eva countered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You're Salvador Nash, the man who thinks he owns this city, but you don't own me and you don't own my family's shop." A slow, lethal smile spread across Salvador's handsome face, the first real emotion his guards had seen on him in years. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, sending a jolt of fire through her veins. "The debt stays," Salvador whispered, "but the terms just changed. You want your bakery saved. You're going to pay it off yourself, starting tonight." "Starting tonight?" Eva repeated, her voice laced with sharp disbelief. She took a deliberate step backward, creating space between them, though the fiery heat of his proximity still lingered on her skin. "I run a business, Mr. Nash. I don't sign blank slates, and I certainly don't surrender my freedom to men who rule by threats." Salvador watched her retreat, his blue eyes tracking her every movement with the quiet focus of an apex predator. He didn't chase her. He simply folded his arms across his broad chest, the dark fabric of his tailored suit stretching taut over his shoulders. "You aren't surrendering anything, Miss Green. You are making a trade," Salvador said calmly, stepping back toward his grand mahogany desk. He picked up a gold fountain pen, casually twirling it between his long fingers. "Your father's total debt stands at $400,000, a sum you cannot produce in 3 days, 3 months, or 3 years. I could seize your bakery by sunrise. I could sell the land to developers before noon. You would have nothing." Eva's breath caught in her throat. The cold, mathematical reality of his words hit her like a physical blow. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag, her knuckles turning stark white. "Or," Salvador continued, his voice dropping into a smooth, hypnotic cadence, "you move into the east wing of this estate for 30 days. You bake for my household. You attend my evening dinners. And in exchange, I clear the mortgage in full. The deed returns to your hands, untethered and unencumbered forever." Eva stared at him, trying to uncover the catch buried beneath the golden offer. "Why? You have a staff of world-class chefs. You have a mansion full of servants. Why would a syndicate don care about a baker from Mulberry Street? Because the world-class chefs cook out of duty, and the women in my social circle exist out of vanity, Salvador said softly, his icy eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. You cook with soul, and more importantly, you look at me like a man, not a god to be worshipped or a monster to be feared. Silence descended upon the study, heavy and thick with unsaid words. The rain continued to lash against the glass windows, casting long, tears-like shadows across the room. Eva felt torn down the middle. Moving into his home was insane. It meant entering the deep, dark heart of the city's most lethal criminal empire. It meant placing herself under the thumb of a man whose reputation was carved in blood. But as she thought of her late father's warm smile, the smell of fresh dough rising in the morning, and the home she had known her entire life, her choice became crystal clear. 30 days, Eva said, her voice steadying as she met his gaze without flinching. No physical touch, no forced compliance. I bake, I sit at your table, and the debt is erased. Salvador's lips twitched into a dark, satisfied smile. He stepped forward, extending a gloved hand toward her. 30 days, Salvador agreed. Welcome to the estate, Eva. Against her better judgment, Eva placed her small, warm hand into his leather-clad palm. The instant their skin made contact, even through the soft grain of his glove, an electric spark shot through her arm, sending a shiver directly to her core. He didn't let go immediately. Instead, he pulled her just an inch closer, his deep voice vibrating through the quiet room. Pack your bags tonight, Miss Green. My driver arrives at 6:00 a.m. And don't bother bringing a mask. I prefer you exactly as you are. By 7 o'clock the following evening, Eva found herself standing in the sprawling, state-of-the-art kitchen of the Nash estate. The marble countertops were pristine, the industrial steel ovens gleamed, and the silence was deafening. True to her word, she hadn't come to act like a captive. She had tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and covered her curves in a simple linen apron. The kitchen smelled of rich vanilla, roasted hazelnut, and warm, caramelized sugar. As she pulled a tray of golden, warm pastries from the oven, heavy footsteps echoed down the grand corridor. Salvador walked into the kitchen, having shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of a tattoo creeping up his throat. He stopped in his tracks, staring at her. In a world full of sterile perfection and artificial beauty, Eva stood amidst flour dust and rising steam, radiating a natural, intoxicating warmth that filled the cold mansion. "You're making a mess of my kitchen," Salvador murmured, though there was no anger in his voice, only a raw, captivating fascination. "I'm making art, Mr. Nash," Eva retorted smoothly, placing a fresh pastry on a porcelain plate and sliding it across the island toward him. "Taste it before you complain." Salvador approached the counter, his presence instantly shrinking the vast room. He picked up the pastry, taking a slow bite. The rich flavor exploded on his palate, but his eyes never left her face. Before he could speak, the kitchen door swung open violently. Marco, Salvador's ruthless lieutenant, marched into the room, his face dark with urgency. "Don Salvador," Marco reported, ignoring Eva completely. "The Falcon family is pushing the perimeter. They know you brought a common woman into the estate. They're calling it a sign of weakness." Salvador's expression hardened instantly, the warmth vanishing behind a wall of absolute ice. He set the pastry down, his posture shifting into that of a commander ready for war. "A weakness," Salvador whispered, his voice dangerously low. "Yes, sir," Marco replied. "They say the great Salvador Nash has lost his edge, softening up for a curvy little street baker." Eva stiffened, her pulse spiking as she watched Salvador's reaction. Salvador slowly turned to Marco, his eyes flashing with a lethal, unbridled fury that made even his hardened lieutenant take a step back. "Tell the Falcons that if they speak her name again," Salvador growled, his voice carrying a promise of total devastation. "I won't just take their territory. I will burn their empire to ash while they watch." He turned back to Eva, his gaze softening just a fraction, revealing the terrifying depth of his growing obsession. "Finish your work, Eva," Salvador murmured softly. "Tonight, the city learns who you belong to." The rain had turned into a relentless midnight storm, slashing against the tall arched windows of the estate's grand dining hall. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Salvador sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, flanked by three of his top lieutenants. Across from him sat Eva, still dressed in her apron, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the fireplace. "You shouldn't have said that to Marco," Eva said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her pulse thrummed fast against her collarbone. "I am not a territory to be claimed, Mr. Nash, and I certainly don't belong to you." The lieutenant stiffened, shocked that anyone dared to challenge the Don in his own hall. Salvador held up a single, dark-gloved hand, silencing his men instantly. A faint, wicked curve touched his lips as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "You are under my roof, Miss Green," Salvador murmured, his icy eyes locking onto hers with absolute intensity. "In this city, under this name, protection and ownership are two sides of the exact same coin. The Falcons do not see a guest. They see something I value, and anything I value becomes an immediate target." "Then let me go back to Mulberry Street," she challenged, rising slightly from her chair, her soft curves cast in the warm glow of the firelight. "If I'm a target here, I might as well face them on my own terms." Salvador was out of his chair in a heartbeat. Before she could react, he had crossed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. He reached out, his long, calloused fingers gently capturing her chin, forcing her to look up into the tempest of his pale eyes. "You walk out those gates tonight and you won't last until dawn," he whispered, his voice low and raspy, vibrating through her chest. "Do you think I brought you here to control you, Eva? I brought you here because for the first time in 10 years, I saw something in this god-forsaken city worth keeping alive." Eva's breath hitched. The raw sincerity in his tone sent a shockwave of heat straight through her veins. She felt the lethal danger radiating off him, but beneath it lay a strange, desperate reverence. He didn't want to break her. He was terrified she would break in a world as dark as his. "I can take care of myself, Salvador," she breathed, using his first name for the very first time. The sound of his name on her lips caused his dark eyes to flame. His grip on her chin softened, his thumb brushing tenderly over the lower curve of her lip. For a fleeting second, the terrifying Don vanished, replaced by a man consumed by an irresistible, dangerous hunger. "Prove it," Salvador breathed, leaning down until his warm breath fanned across her cheek. "Tell me to let you go. Tell me you want me to walk away, and I will." Eva opened her mouth to speak, to demand her distance, but her throat went bone dry. The heavy, electric space between their lips shrank to mere millimeters. Her heart hammered wildly, not out of terror, but out of a sudden, roaring desire that terrified her far more than his reputation ever could. The high-pitched shattering of glass exploded through the front parlor, followed immediately by the sharp, deafening roar of automatic gunfire. "Down," Salvador bellowed, his instincts instantly taking over. In a single, fluid motion, he swept his massive arm around Eva's waist, hauling her lush body against his chest and throwing her beneath the heavy oak table just as a hail of bullets ripped through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning expensive artwork and lead crystal into a violent storm of debris. Salvador drew a sleek matte black firearm from his shoulder holster, his body forming a solid shield over Eva. The cold, lethal killer had returned, but his arm wrapped around her waist held her with protective, unyielding iron strength. "Marco, secure the back hall," Salvador roared over the thunder of gunfire, his voice echoing like war drums. He looked down at Eva, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated fury. They just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Salvador, Eva gasped, clinging tightly to the lapels of his suit jacket as dust and wood splinters rained down around them. He pressed a fierce, lingering kiss against the top of her head, his heart thumping wildly against her palm. "Stay low, stay quiet," Salvador growled into her hair, his dark voice laced with absolute, terrifying promise. "I am going to end this." The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but to Eva, every second stretched into an eternity. The sharp smell of cordite and burnt velvet filled the grand hall, mingling with the bitter rain sweeping through the shattered, gaping windows. When the final gunshots faded into a heavy, ringing silence, Salvador didn't immediately stand. He remained crouched over Eva, his broad body a solid wall between her and the devastation, his dark suit dusted with plaster and glass. "Are you hit?" Salvador demanded, his hands moving over her arms, her waist, her shoulders with a frantic, desperate precision. His pale eyes scanned her face, stripped of all cold calculation, leaving only a raw, unshielded panic. "Eva, look at me. Are you hurt?" I'm fine," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at him. She reached up, her small, warm fingers brushing away a stray shard of glass caught in his dark hair. "Salvador, you're bleeding." A thin line of crimson was trickling down from his temple, but he didn't even flinch. He simply caught her hand, pressing her palm against his cheek, leaning into her warmth for a brief, shuddering second before his expression shuddered into absolute steel. "Marco," Salvador growled, standing up and pulling Eva smoothly to her feet. "3 shooters down in the courtyard, Don Salvador," Marco said, stepping into the room, stepping over shattered glass with a heavy, grim expression. "Falcon's men. They didn't come to take the house. They came to send a message." "They sent a death warrant," Salvador corrected softly, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper that sent a chill through the warm room. "Clear the bodies. Lock down the estate perimeter. Nobody enters, nobody leaves." He turned back to Eva, taking her arm with a gentle but unyielding grip, guiding her out of the ruined dining hall and upstairs toward his personal quarters, the highest, most heavily guarded wing of the estate. "You can't keep me hidden up here like a trophy," Eva said, her inner resistance flaring back to life as she walked alongside him through the dim, mahogany-lined corridors. "I have a bakery to run, Salvador. I have orders to fulfill. My father's customers." "Your father's shop is being guarded by 4 of my best men right now," Salvador interrupted, stopping outside a massive set of double doors. He turned to face her, his hands coming up to rest lightly on her waist. "The Falcons know who you are now, Eva. They know you are the only variable in this city I cannot afford to lose. If you walk out those gates tomorrow, they will use you to bring me to my knees." Eva looked into his eyes, searching for the ruthless Mafia Don, but finding only a man terrified of her mortality. Her heart gave a sudden, painful throb. "And what if I don't want you on your knees, Salvador? What if I want you alive?" Salvador's breath caught in his throat. His hands tightened slightly against her waist, pulling her soft curves flush against his hard frame. "Then you stay in my rooms, where I can see you, where I can protect you." Before she could answer, a young guard rushed up the stairs, panting, an encrypted tablet clutched in his hand. "Don Salvador, a message just came through the private channel. It's from your uncle, Lord Cashin." Salvador's jaw tightened. Cashin was the senior head of the Syndicate Council, the traditionalist who had arranged the high society match Salvador had rejected. "Speak," Salvador ordered, coldness returning to his voice. "Lord Cashin has called an emergency council meeting at the high society gala tomorrow night," the guard reported, nervously glancing at Eva. "He says if you do not bring a proper heiress to finalize the council's syndicate alliance, the council will declare your leadership unfit and authorize the Falcons to take Mulberry Street by force." Eva's face drained of color. They weren't just threatening her life anymore. They were targeting her home, her father's legacy, and the entire neighborhood she loved. Salvador's eyes flared with a terrifying, apocalyptic rage. He looked from the guard down to Eva, taking her flour-dusted hand in his. "Tell my uncle the alliance will be settled tomorrow night," Salvador said softly, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "And tell him I will be bringing my bride." "Your bride?" Eva's voice echoed off the grand mahogany walls, sharp and disbelieving. She yanked her hand back from his grip, her eyes wide with a dangerous mix of fury and fear. "You don't get to make decisions for my life, Salvador. I am a baker, not a piece on your political chessboard." Salvador didn't flinch. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his immense shadow swallowing her whole. The cold, unyielding Don had vanished, replaced by a man whose raw, desperate intensity burned brighter than the fireplace downstairs. "You think this is a game to me?" Salvador growled softly, his voice a low vibration that thrummed right through her boots. He reached out, his long fingers carefully cupping the back of her neck, tilting her head up until her brown eyes locked onto his stormy blue ones. "My uncle wants to burn Little Italy to the ground to force me onto my knees. He wants to hand you to the Falcons as a statement of power. I am offering you the only shield this city respects. By parading me in front of high society vultures who look at me like filth," Eva countered, her chest heaving, her soft body pressed so close to his that she could feel the thunderous, erratic rhythm of his heart beneath his dress shirt. "They want a silk-draped heiress, Salvador. I have flour under my fingernails and curves that don't fit into their fragile little molds." "Let them look," Salvador whispered, his thumb slowly tracing the line of her jawline, sending an electric shiver straight down her spine. "Let every aristocratic coward in that room see the only woman who ever made me bow. You are worth more than all their bloodlines combined, Eva." The breath caught in her throat. The sheer weight of his declaration hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocatingly sweet. For a terrifying second, she didn't want to fight him. She wanted to lean into his chest, to lose herself in the fierce, lethal sanctuary of his arms. 30 days, Salvador," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly. "That was the deal." "The deal changed the moment they fired at you," Salvador murmured, his lips brushing against her temple, soft and protective. "Get some sleep, little baker. Tomorrow we go to war." The morning brought a deceitful calm. The estate was silent, the wreckage of the dining hall already cleared away by a silent army of servants. Eva spent the afternoon locked in her suite, packing the marble floors while high society dressmakers, sent personally by Salvador, fitted her for the evening gala. They brought corsets and delicate silk, but Eva refused them all. Instead, she chose a deep emerald velvet gown that hugged every rich curve of her body, flowing off her hips like liquid silk, leaving her shoulders bare and her dark, wavy hair falling wildly down her back. She wore no pearls, no diamonds, only her pride. By 8 o'clock, the heavy doors of her suite opened. Salvador stood in the doorway, dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo that made him look like the absolute monarch of the dark. When his eyes swept over her, taking in the emerald velvet, her flushed skin, and the fierce fire burning in her gaze, his breath hit his throat with a ragged hitch. "You look," Salvador started, his voice rough, losing its usual icy composure, "immortal." Before Eva could reply, a sudden, sharp commotion echoed from the grand courtyard below. Voices raised in argument were cut short by the harsh, metallic click of a gun being cocked. Salvador's expression hardened instantly. He shoved Eva behind his back, drawing his sidearm in one fluid, lethal motion as he stepped out onto the grand balcony overlooking the foyer. Down below, Marco was held at gunpoint by 4 men dressed in immaculate white suits, the signature attire of the Falcon elite guard. Standing in the center of the foyer was Count Falcon himself, flanked by Salvador's uncle, Lord Cashin. "Salvador," Cashin called up, his voice dripping with condescending arrogance, Your presence is required at the gala, but we came to ensure you didn't bring any undesirable company." Count Falcon sneered, raising his hand to gesture toward the stairs. "The council has spoken, Don Nash. Hand over the Baker girl now and we will spare your territory. Refuse and Mulberry Street burns before midnight." Eva felt her blood run cold. She stepped up beside Salvador, refusing to hide. Salvador didn't look at his uncle. He didn't look at Falcon. His eyes narrowed onto the men holding Marco at gunpoint, his voice dropping into a deadly, chilling whisper that made the entire foyer freeze. "You stepped into my home," Salvador said softly, raising his weapon with absolute precision. "You threatened my city, and you dared to demand my wife." "She isn't your wife," Falcon barked. "She is my queen," Salvador growled, "and this is your execution." Before Falcon could react, the grand foyer erupted into absolute chaos. Salvador's gun cracked like thunder, the shot ringing out with terrifying precision. The lead guard holding Marco dropped instantly. Marco scrambled backward, sweeping the legs out from under another gunman and drawing his weapon in a heartbeat. Glass shattered, shouting filled the air, and gunshots echoed off the high marble walls as Salvador's security force converged on the intruders from every corner of the manor. Salvador didn't give Falcon a chance to breathe. He threw his arm around Eva's waist, shielding her body with his own as he guided her down the grand staircase, firing systematically with lethal, icy accuracy. He moved like an unstoppable force of nature, a warlord protecting the only thing in the world that mattered. "Cashin, Falcon, fall back!" one of the surviving guards yelled, dragging the wounded syndicate heads toward the heavy oak doors as the Nash soldiers overwhelmed them. Within minutes, the foyer fell dead silent once more, save for the heavy breathing of armed men and the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Salvador stood at the base of the stairs, his tuxedo immaculate except for a splash of crimson across his white cuff. He turned slowly toward Eva, his eyes scanning her up and down, checking for any scratch, any drop of blood that wasn't his enemy's. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice raw and heavy with residual adrenaline. "I'm whole, Salvador," Eva said, her voice remarkably steady despite the storm that had just unfolded around her. She reached out, her small fingers wrapping around his wrist, feeling the frantic, hammering pulse beneath his skin. They meant every word. They're going to destroy Little Italy if we walk into that gala. "Let them try," Salvador growled, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. His thumb stroked her cheek, leaving a faint smudge of ash against her glowing skin. "They think my feelings for you make me weak. They don't understand that loving you makes me utterly unkillable." Eva's heart skipped a beat, the word loving lingering between them, heavy and irrefutable. She looked into the pale blue storm of his eyes and realized the truth. The icy, feared Don of New York was entirely, helplessly at her mercy. "Then we don't go to that gala to defend ourselves," Eva said, her brown eyes blazing with a fierce, untamed fire. "We go to take their crowns." The Manhattan Grand Ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and silk gowns. The city's highest-born aristocrats and syndicate lords mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, sipping champagne while murmuring about the fate of the Nash Empire. Lord Cashin stood at the center of the room, a glass of vintage wine in hand, flanked by Count Falcon, who wore a fresh bandage around his shoulder. "Salvador won't show," Cashin announced smoothly to the surrounding crowd of nobles. "He has abandoned his duty for a street commoner. Tonight, the council strips him of his title." Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom slammed open. The chatter ceased instantly. The room went dead silent. Salvador Nash walked into the hall. He looked every bit the lethal monarch, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze lethal and cold. But he was not alone. At his side, her hand held firmly in his dark-gloved grip, was Eva. She wore her emerald velvet dress like a royal robe, her full curves commanding the room, her head held high as her fierce gaze swept over the shocked faces of high society. Gasps filled the room, heiresses clutched their pearls, and noblemen backed away in shock. Salvador led Eva straight to the center of the floor, stopping directly in front of his uncle and Count Falcon. "I heard the council was looking for me," Salvador said, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom like a tolling bell. "So I brought the future of the Nash syndicate to meet you." The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Every aristocratic eye was glued to the center of the room, where the city's most feared don stood hand in hand with a woman who broke every silent rule high society had ever written. Lord Cassion's face contorted with white-hot rage, his champagne glass trembling in his hand. He stepped forward, his eyes cutting toward Eva with venomous disdain. "You dare bring a common street baker into the sacred halls of the Syndicate Council," Cassion sneered, his voice echoing across the quiet room. "Look at her, Salvador. She has no bloodline, no fortune, no standing. She is a nobody from Little Italy, and you endanger our entire legacy for a fleeting obsession." Count Falcon spat blood onto the polished marble floor, his wounded shoulder bleeding through his white suit jacket. "She is a distraction, a weakness. The council will never bow to a woman who smells of sugar instead of status." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd of highborn families. The heiresses whispered behind jewel-encrusted fans, waiting for Eva to crumble under the weight of their judgment, waiting for her to run back to her flour-dusted kitchen in shame. Instead, Eva stepped forward. She didn't hide behind Salvador. She let go of his hand and took 2 deliberate steps toward Lord Cassion, her emerald velvet dress swaying gracefully around her curves. She looked the old man dead in the eye, her posture radiating pure, unshakable dignity. "You call me a nobody because I work for my bread?" Eva asked, her voice clear, melodious, and sharp enough to slice through silk. "My family built our legacy with honest labor, sweat, and love for our community. You sit on golden thrones paid for by fear and blood, calling yourselves nobility. But when a real threat comes to your door, you hide behind assassins and broken promises." She turned her gaze slowly toward the entire room, taking in every shocked face. "I may not have a title," Eva declared, her brown eyes blazing with fierce pride. "But I have something none of you will ever possess, a soul that cannot be bought and a heart that doesn't bow to cowards." Salvador watched her, his pale blue eyes burning with raw, intoxicating pride. A dark, dangerous smile slowly spread across his handsome features. He stepped beside her, placing his heavy, warm hand over her bare shoulder, pulling her firmly against his side. "You heard my bride," Salvador said softly, his gravelly voice carrying a promise of total devastation. "She speaks for the Nash Empire now, and anyone who disrespects her." He reached inside his tuxedo jacket, drawing a single, silver-engraved ledger, the master deed to every property, debt, and contract held by the Syndicate Council, and threw it onto the marble table in front of Cassion. "Is officially stripped of their title, their land, and their protection," Salvador growled. "The old council ends tonight." Panic erupted through the room. Cassion went deathly pale, realizing in a single second that Salvador hadn't spent the afternoon preparing for a debate. He had bought out the council's debts, seizing every asset they owned. "You can't do this," Cassion shouted, backing away as Salvador's armed guards silently surrounded the exits of the ballroom. "It's madness." "It isn't madness, Uncle," Salvador whispered, his gaze locked on Eva's face, his heart beating with absolute certainty. "It's justice." The high society gala dissolved into an agonizing retreat for the old elite. By midnight, Lord Cassion's leverage was shattered, Count Falcon was driven into hiding, and the syndicate's ancient, bloated council had ceased to exist. In a single evening, Salvador Nash had dismantled a century of cold tradition, not with mindless violence, but by building an unbreakable fortress around the woman he loved. 3 days later, The morning sun rose bright and golden over Little Italy. Mulberry Street smelled once again of sweet yeast, rich espresso, and warm vanilla. The red-painted wooden door of Green's bakery was thrown open to the crisp air. The neighborhood was alive with music and laughter, but the heavy, predatory shadow that had hung over the street for months was completely gone. The syndicate's enforcers were no longer lurking in dark sedans to intimidate the shopkeepers. Instead, three of Salvador's top men stood at the street corner in crisp suits, quietly acting as a permanent protective wall for the neighborhood. Inside the shop, flour dusted the counters like fresh snow. Eva stood at the wooden island, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, carefully piping sweet ricotta into golden cannoli shells. Her emerald gown was gone, replaced by her familiar apron, but the quiet, unshakable aura of authority she had claimed in the grand ballroom remained etched into every movement. The silver bell above the front door chimed softly. Eva looked up, a warm smile touching her lips. Salvador stepped into the bakery. He didn't wear his usual cold, armored tuxedo. He wore a simple dark dress shirt with the sleeves turned up, revealing the strong, tattooed forearms that had held her through the storm. In his hand, he carried a thick leather folder. He walked past the display glass, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floorboards, stopping right beside her at the counter. Without a word, he placed the folder in front of her and opened it. Inside was the original mortgage ledger for Green's bakery, stamped paid in full in bold red ink alongside the newly registered deed of ownership, bearing only one name, Eva Green. Eva ran her fingers over the crisp paper, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The debt that had threatened to destroy her father's memory, the weight that had carried her into the lion's den, was finally gone. She was completely, unconditionally free. "The debt is cleared, Eva," Salvador murmured, his deep baritone soft, stripped of all icy command. "Your home is yours. Your father's legacy is safe. You owe me nothing." Eva looked up from the paper, meeting his pale blue eyes. The fierce, terrifying Don who had made every noblewoman in the city tremble with fear was standing in a flour-dusted kitchen, looking at her as if she were his entire universe. "And my 30 days," she whispered, her voice laced with a gentle, teasing warmth. "What about our arrangement?" Salvador stepped closer, reaching out to gently thumb a trace of flour from her cheek, his touch lingering against her warm skin. "The 30 days are over, little baker. You can walk out that door, and I will never force you to return to my world." Eva smiled, a bright, dazzling expression that lit up the entire room. She didn't turn toward the door. Instead, she closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around his waist and leaning her soft curves flush against his chest. She felt his heart leap, hammering wild and fast against her ribs. "You really don't get it, do you, Salvador?" Eva whispered, looking up into his dark, overwhelmed eyes. "I didn't conquer your estate just to run away, and I'm not leaving the man who built a kingdom just to keep me safe." Salvador's breath hitched. A rare, breathtaking smile broke across his handsome face as he wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her completely into his space and lifting her off her feet. He leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a deep, fierce, and protective kiss that sealed their bond forever. The noblewomen of high society had feared his dark domain, terrified of the monster in the suit. But they had looked for power in titles, pearls, and fear. Eva Green had walked in with nothing but flour on her hands and fire in her heart, and in doing so, the Curvy baker didn't just survive the Mafia boss's lair. She became its queen.